I'm going to talk about the Roaring 20s. I'm going to bring us back 100 years ago, and I'm going to talk about art, ecstasy, and the age of roaring excess. And I'm going to start with a couple that were the it couple of 1920, Zelda and Scott Fitzgerald. Zelda and Scott knew how to party. They took their summer honeymoon, and it was a whole summer for their honeymoon, and it was off the hook. It was 5 months of debauchery that went on to inspire one of literature's greatest works. Zelda's sire was fabulous. She was a flamboyant Southern belle with gold flame hair. Scott, officially Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald, after a distant relative, but just Scott to his friends and family, had just been released from an uneventful, thankfully, stint in the military during World War I, and was almost overnight both relatively flush and relatively famous off of his remarkable debut novel. Following immediately upon the publication of This Side of Paradise, which sold out its first printing in a matter of days, the young couple were wed in a tiny ceremony in New York City, not attended by either set of parents, on April 3rd, 1920. But what little care they put into the wedding ceremony, they saved for the honeymoon plans. They booked in at the posh Biltmore Hotel. Scott paid for Zelda to get an entirely new wardrobe in New York City, suitable for glamming around the big city, and glam they did. There are stories of Zelda running in traffic and riding on the outside of taxi cabs. Scott turned handstands in the Biltmore lobby. They delighted in going out to the theater and being quiet during the loud parts and very loud during the quiet parts. Eventually, they were kicked out of the Biltmore for their shenanigans, so they took the party to the Commodore, another reasonably fancy hotel in New York City. But they were soon kicked out of there as well, allegedly for turning around and around and around in the new revolving doors for half an hour, preventing guests from entering or leaving. All out of hotels, they decided to take the party to the countryside. And in their new-to-them motor car, they made their way to rural Westport, Connecticut, 50 miles from New York City, where Zelda could swim, Scott could write, and they could entertain outside the watchful gaze of hotel staff. The newlyweds were, however, off to a rocky start. Zelda crashed their new-to-them motor car. Laundry and dishes piled up, and the house descended immediately into chaos. And they fought like drunken cats and dogs. But their next-door neighbor might have been the man we know as Gatsby, and he knew how to throw a very good party. Effie Lewis, a young millionaire, owned the multi-acre estate next to where the Fitzgeralds had settled. It was a massive, sprawling place, reminiscent in many ways of the descriptions we see of Gatsby's rolling lawns and access to the seaside in the book. Lewis was locally famous for his fabulous and over-the-top parties. He invited celebrities like Houdini and brought the best bands, the most exotic entertainment, like in this article it mentions an animal circus, and critically, an ample and free-flowing supply of illicitly sourced booze. This is the only image I could find of an actual party at his place, but you can see the crescent-shaped bandstand with the band out front, and just the type of well-heeled party people that Fitzgerald would later write about in The Great Gatsby. The Fitzgeralds also frequently frequented a local speakeasy known as the Campo Inn, where there are stories of Zelda once again riding up this steep driveway on the outside of a motor car, but this time nude. So scandals seemed to swarm around the fabulous Fitzgeralds and their friends. Scott, reflecting upon the age, said, "It was an age of miracles, it was an age of art, it was an age of excess, and it was an age of satire." But the epic parties of the 1920s are really not that different from the epic parties of ancient Greece that Tre was just talking about. They both sought to find joy and pleasure, but also the experience of transcendence through music and dance and drink and drugs, to be present in that exact moment in communion with your fellow party people. And piss off the older and more conservative parts of society. In 1925, There's so many of these, you could just do a slideshow just of these, but one newspaper wrote, "We defy anyone who goes about with his eyes open to deny that there is, as never before, an attitude on the part of young folk which is best described as grossly thoughtless, rude, and utterly selfish." But in fact, people, especially young people, have partied like this in pretty much every generation and every culture unless actively suppressed. And in many of those cases, religious fervor fills the same void. This is, at its heart, the pursuit of the ecstatic. From the ancient Greek, ekstasis, it means outside oneself, and it's the altered state of consciousness that produces euphoria and connection. So the Roaring Twenties may have been pursuing more than their fair share of euphoria because the Jazz Age was born out of the trauma of World War I, race riots, the epidemic of the flu, and Prohibition in the United States. And so party time was both a response and a rebellion, as well as a pursuit of healing and connection, led both by the so-called lost generation of which the Fitzgeralds belonged, and also to the younger generation who were too young to actually face the horrors of World War I. In the mid-20s, the Fitzgeralds took the party to France, joining another American couple on the French Riviera for a season of partying with what would go on to become a who's who list of the lost generation's greatest artists, performers, musicians, and writers. Sarah and Gerald Murphy were the hosts of this extraordinary gathering of creative minds, which included Hemingway and Dorothy Parker, Cole Porter and Stravinsky, and Jean Cocteau and Picasso, among many more. They drank on the Prohibition-free beaches. They sunbathed and held picnics and had fancy dress outings. At the time, the Riviera was not yet a summertime destination. It's where the fabulous people of the big cities came to escape the winters. So the rowdy crew had a lot of the sunshine and blue waters and sandy beaches to themselves to do with what they pleased. The Murphys were wealthy. They both came from wealthy families, and they had fled from New York City a few years earlier to France to escape their families and perhaps the inconveniences of Prohibition, which would have put a damper on their lavish lifestyle. The previously unknown couple broke into society and partied with Parisian luminaries. Sarah became a muse of Picasso. He painted her 5 times, and an obsession of Hemingway. Gerald dabbled in painting. And although Scott Fitzgerald famously quipped that all of his characters were autobiographical, and they are, sort of, to a certain extent, the Murphys are thought to be part of the inspiration both for the setting and the characters of Nicole and Dick Diver in his novel Tender is the Night. And many people suspect that Hemingway's central couple in The Garden of Eden was also based on the Murphys. So it was all fabulous while it lasted. But like so many good things, it had to come to an end. In Echoes of the Jazz Age, F. Scott Fitzgerald reflected in 1931 that the wild days and even wilder nights of the Roaring Twenties, a whole race going hedonistic, deciding on pleasure, were officially over. He said, "But it was not to be. Somebody had blundered, and the most expensive orgy in history was over." After that, he reflects further. He says, "Now once more the belt is tight, and we summon the proper expression of horror as we look back at our wasted youth. Sometimes, though, there's a ghostly rumble amongst the drums, an asthmatic whisper in the trombones that swings me back to the early 20s, when we drank wood alcohol and every day in every way grew better and better. And there was a first abortive shortening of the skirts, and the girls all looked alike in their sweater dresses, and people you didn't want to know said, 'Yes, we have no bananas.' And it seemed only a question of a few years before the older people would step aside and let the world be run by those who saw things as they were. And it all seemed rosy and romantic to us who were young then, because we will never feel quite so intensely about our surroundings anymore." Near the end of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, Hunter S. Thompson drives off into the sunset to escape the consequences of his actions after a session of debauchery worthy of Bacchus himself. Famously, he cautioned, "Buy the ticket, take the ride." This is the aftermath of every epic party, the dreaded hangover in its many forms. Every god asks for sacrifices, and Bacchus is no different. His pleasures come at a cost. It seems no accident to me that both Euripides' Bacchae and Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby, and indeed the Fitzgeralds' personal lives, were tragedies. All the pleasures of Bacchus are ephemeral. So what can we take away from this cautionary tale? We find ourselves here a century later in our own what the fuck 20s, on the heels of our own pandemic and in uncertain times. Bacchus still walks amongst us, inspiring escape and hedonism, opening the door to euphoria and connection. But perhaps we should worship at the temple of Bacchus at our own risk. And maybe, like those that came before us, take notes and create art. Because the Bacchanalia has always inspired a second act after the party. The reflections and the memories, the epic stories, and the works of art which long outlast the moments of pleasure. And this was true in the ancient world, and it emerged in the radical new arts of the 1920s, and of course in the literature of that lost generation, which lets us bear witness to their gloriously debauched youth long after the honeymoon was over. So with that in mind, I invite you to raise a glass with me. I'd like to raise my glass to the pleasures of the moment and the legacies of a lifetime. May your 20s be roaring, your stories inspire envy, and your art endure for the ages. Cheers.